Hello, it's Kit Allowitz with another Leadership Journey video, checking in today, yet again from beautiful Utah. How can you beat this topography? Today's topic is entitled, The 2 Necessary and Essential Ingredients for a Dynamic Culture, which is what we're seeking. Now, I've been hanging around with Dr. Matthew Chodkowski lately learning. He explains that there are 2 necessary ingredients at a high level that are essential to making culture work. These 2 ingredients, call them the 2 C's, are consciousness and communication. So I begin with an invitation to you. What is your consciousness level? And number 2, what is your communication capability? Years and years ago, Dr. Matthew Chodkowski worked for an ice cream manufacturing company, sounds pretty attractive, as well as actually did a small consulting job for a cottage cheese company. So besides being all things knowledgeable about leadership and principles, Dr. Chodkowski is also a cottage cheese and ice cream expert, making him an ideal conversationalist to talk about culture, how we create the conditions for an ideal cultural state. So I gathered a few things from Dr. Matthew Chodkowski I'd like to share in this video today, talking about these 2 ingredients, because we intentionally are trying to get to this dynamic culture within an organization, understand it, and put our arms around it. So back in the days when ice cream making and cottage cheese churning existed for Dr. Matthew Chodkowski, the concept or the idea of corporate culture was just starting to be introduced into business. Can you imagine? That was years ago. The precursor to culture, they called that climate or the environment, which we still may use today. In those days of old, when organizations started talking about culture, many thought of the idea of culturing milk, or even, as we experimented in the May 2022 summit, is the idea of yogurt. Like the idea that there are 2 necessary and essential, let's call them bacteria, healthy bacteria, that make an organizational success, they also exist to make yogurt happen. And those are, and I'll probably butcher them, the first one is Lactobacillus bulgarius and Streptococcus thermopolius. Butchered, those are the 2 bacteria that make yogurt a possibility. There are equally 2 and necessary ingredients for organizational culture, and these are consciousness and communication. Okay, so let's talk about consciousness for a second in terms of definition. Consciousness refers to your individual awareness of your unique thoughts, memories, feelings, sensations, and environments. Essentially, your consciousness is your awareness of yourself and the world around you. This awareness is subjective, and yet it's very unique to you. Number 2, communication. Defining communication refers to the elements that allow the transfer and receipt of information for mutual meaning and advancement. To the degree that you have human consciousness is to the degree that you can create shortcuts called heuristics for 2 people to solve problems and make judgments effectively, efficiently, and quickly. Dr. Chodkowski explains that there are 2 necessary and essential elements to make culture work. Again, those are consciousness and communication. Consider a variation of consciousness and communication. And here it is. Humans and heuristics, in the sense that a human being is required to have human consciousness. And heuristics are initially used to communicate what is consciousness through nonverbal signals, signs, and facial expressions. You follow? It is consciousness and communication that produces knowledge, learning, values, beliefs, and assumptions, and their material and behavioral representations, and therefore manifestations. In the May 2022 summit, we demonstrated that the similarities between the bacteria for making healthy yogurt to conscious and communication as the key elements of a dynamic culture. What's interesting is that the culturing process is actually a fermentation reaction created by chemical energy. Taking just a tiny bit of liberties here, you can relate the 2 concepts because organizational culture is organic and dynamic, meaning energetic. It's a social learning process. So let me give you just kind of a fairly accurate flow in terms of representation of how consciousness and communication create the culture that creates the outputs, that creates the results that we get for the customer. It's kind of a flow if you can imagine going in a straight line down. Consciousness, communication, information, knowledge, learning, values, beliefs, assumptions, artifacts, and behavior. So, a little bit more about these two types that make up a dynamic culture. There is a common understanding of culture from an anthropological perspective as well. Culture, on the one hand, is the enlightenment and the excellence of taste required by intellectual and artistic training. This definition alludes to the frequent use of culture as highlighted in art, literature, music, and philosophy. I'm going deep here, I know. And even architecture and religion of a given group, society, or civilization. Some refer to this as high culture or cultural with a capital C. Now, on the other hand, culture can also denote the integrated patterns of knowledge, values, beliefs, and behaviors that emerge from a group learning processes and are transmitted to succeeding generations, or in our case, to the next generation of our organization, which is also described as the customary values, beliefs, social norms, and material artifacts of a social group. Some refer to this as the low culture because it encompasses a society's high culture. Basically, low culture consists of the broader cultural elements, and high culture refers to the more refined cultural elements. Culture, in conclusion on this point, is a dynamic rather than a static process. It's a we, us, them. It's a living organization, just like yogurt. Now, in general systems thinking theory, which we've been talking a lot about, dynamic systems are by a nature complex because they include many elements that can never fully be completely separated and studied. And the relationship among those elements is interactive and continuously evolving. Now, although scientists of the past few centuries thought that they could study living systems and physical laws as one would study a machine, let's say, contemporary investigators are increasingly admitting that every attempt to combine the two and do it together is proving pretty darn inadequate. Likewise, much of the human phenomena, including the cultures that it produces, they're pretty darn highly dynamic as well. Social scientists, in fact, now admit that viewing the human system mind, a dynamic system in itself, using a static framework tends to always fall short. Engineers now typically, for the most part, admit that a static system of most machines, when studied closely enough, are acted on by dynamic forces as well. Let me just go one more level deep here. An investigator of culture then must be open to the idea of encountering a bewildering set of diversible variables that cannot be reduced to neat formulas, as well as the phenomenon that this whole thing cannot be predicted on some static systems thinking. It's dynamic. It's ever changing. This dynamic nature of culture and systems is also the reason why we need teams-based cross-functional learning in our organization. Integration and institutionalization are the only effective means for attempting to understand culture and the system in which it resides. So in conclusion, I come back to where we started. Culture, yogurt, cottage cheese. My invitation to you is this: what is your consciousness level? Number two, what is your communication capability? I'm Kid Alowitz, checking in from Utah. We'll see you next time.